Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The Department of Justice is suing Texas for the second time in a month over the state's new voting laws.
The Attorney General has made clear that the Justice Department will not stand idly by in the face of unlawful attempts to restrict access to the ballot. Today's filing demonstrates that commitment to this charge.
While the president's attempts to institute federal voting reforms have stalled, the DOJ has filed a handful of lawsuits to challenge measures in individual states like Texas, Georgia, and Arizona. In the fight against COVID, health officials are expressing some optimism over the Omicron variant's potency. Early indications show Omicron-related infections may not be as severe as those related to the Delta variant. The stock and oil markets responded positively to that news. On Capitol Hill, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer continues to express optimism that the Senate will be able to get the president's social and economic spending plan passed by Christmas. Meanwhile, the Biden administration is dealing with some pressing international issues. New U.S. intelligence assessments indicate a massive Russian troop presence along its shared border with Ukraine. It comes as President Biden is slated to have a direct call with Russian President Putin.
This is the moment for Russia to pull back their military buildup at the border, that diplomacy is the right path forward here, but that we are going to continue to coordinate closely with our partners, our transatlantic partners, on a range of economic sanctions and steps that couldn't be taken should President Putin decide to move forward.
The White House also announced a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. The move is to protest what the administration says are China's human rights abuses. Beijing is threatening unnamed countermeasures in response.
Not sending a U.S. delegation sends a clear message that we cannot conduct ourselves with business as usual, that we are not in a state where business as usual is appropriate at a time where there are human rights abuses that we have been outspoken about, that we have taken actions on, and we feel this sends a clear message.
For more, I want to bring in Major Garrett and Meridith McGraw. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent, and Meridith is a national political correspondent for Politico. Welcome. It's good to see you both on this Monday. Meridith, let me start with you. The economy is showing some positive signs on unemployment and rising wages on hopes the Omicron variant may not be as bad as originally feared. Now, the Dow jumped some 700 points. Can that help the president's dipping poll numbers?
Well, the stock market was certainly optimistic today with the news that the Omicron variant might not be as severe as what we initially thought. They initially thought it could be much more infectious, and while it is spreading, the symptoms just aren't as bad. So that, of course, was good news for the stock markets today, but there are still issues on the horizon for President Biden. Inflation continues to be a problem, and that is a lingering effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, supply chain issues continue to hover over this administration. But they are showing that they're trying to do everything that they can to mitigate potential, casualties from Omicron. Today, the Biden administration began to implement a new requirement for air travelers to the U.S. that they need to show a negative COVID-19 test one day before boarding their flight. And they're working to fast track the authorization of revamped COVID-19 vaccines to combat this new variant. But still, issues with the economy will continue to hover over the president. And who's to say that the stock market going up today is going to be a long-term boost for President Biden.
Well, Major, Meridith mentioned inflation and supply chain issues. Can those economic issues be resolved before the midterms?
They certainly can be resolved, and the real political potency of inflation, Elaine, is persistence. If inflation continues to rise and remain persistently high throughout 2022, that becomes an abject political vulnerability for Democrats and the Biden White House. The Biden White House believes that inflation will not be transitory. That's a word that the Fed chairman got rid of last week, though he had used it a lot. Inflation is going to be here to stay. It just is a matter of magnitude. And the White House is very hopeful that inflationary pressures will ease after the new year dawns and that all the inflation headlines that have been dogging this White House and Democrats generally for the last 2 or 3 months will begin to wane in intensity as 2022 marches forward. If that happens, the political prospects for the president improve, because everywhere else in the economy, generally speaking, things look positive. Even in last week's very disappointing jobs number, it was written by many organizations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the first 10 months of this year, when it put out its first monthly assessment of how many jobs were created over those 10 months, had to revise those numbers upward by the factor of 1 million new jobs created over those 10 months, meaning there's just a lot of fluidity in economic data. Things are harder to measure seasonally and with traditional means of counting those who are in the labor force, who have returned to it out of this deep pandemic. So there's just a lot of volatility and fluidity in the data. And the White House has gotten more of its share of bad news than good news in the last 2 or 3 months. If that trajectory changes in early 2022, its political prospects will doubtlessly improve.
Meridith, while the president's efforts on federal voting rights have stalled, the Department of Justice continues to sue states over voting rights. Is this a more pragmatic workaround?
Well, today the DOJ announced that they are suing Texas over their recent redistricting of House and congressional maps, saying that those new districts disenfranchise minorities and that they also violate the Voting Rights Act. The suit was filed in federal court, and it claims, quote, that refusing to recognize the state's growing minority electorate is what Texas is doing, and they're asking that the court stop the state from holding elections. There was one really interesting statistic that was included in that that filing, and that's that Texas's population has grown 4 million people, and 95% of those people are minorities. So this suit is about protecting the voting rights of those minorities, and the DOJ has already sued Texas last month over their election laws, including things like drive-through voting that Texas banned. So it's really just the next step for the Biden administration in terms of pushing back at some of these states that are moving to restrict voting rights in places like Texas.
Major, the White House officially announced that the U.S. will diplomatically boycott the Beijing Winter Olympics. How significant is that?
In terms of personnel, not very significant at all. In terms of symbolism and depriving the Chinese of American respect, that's very important. And the language the Biden administration used, talking about genocide and human rights violations that were on the border of atrocities, those are very specific, very heavyweight words. And China always resists any interference in what it calls domestic issues. The particular ones raised by the Biden White House deal with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which is in the far western province of China. And the Chinese regard that as deeply their internal matters, and they don't want anyone, the United States or anyone else, interfering with those internal matters. Now, you have to ask yourself, would a lot of diplomats from any country, the United States or any allies or anyone in the region, be traveling in large numbers to Beijing? No. Why? Because of COVID restrictions and general hesitancy. So it's not as if we are depriving the Chinese of some large diplomatic delegation that was packing its bags, getting ready to go to the Winter Olympics. They were never going to go in the first place. It's more the language and the timing and the sort of insult to China as it's going to be on the world stage for the Winter Olympics that is most offensive to Beijing. But it's not the only issue separating the two countries. China's continued threats about Taiwan, its impeding of human rights and democracy in Hong Kong are just two others. And there are a lot of issues between these two governments. This just intensifies the sense of estrangement, even though there was a very long effort between Xi Jinping, leader of China, and President Biden to have a virtual conversation to kind of soften some of these things. Clearly, the administration wanted to take a symbolic maneuver over the Winter Olympics to appease some members in Congress, Republican and Democrat, who wanted a tougher stand on human rights without dramatically intensifying the disagreement with China. Doing so in this way, the White House hopes will send a signal, but not create a deeper breach in relations.
Well, Meridith, what are the top issues that Congress needs to tie up before the upcoming holiday break?
Well, how much time do you have?
How much time
quite
a big question, I know.
To get done before Christmas, and the clock certainly is ticking. I actually had to write it all down so I didn't miss it. For one, federal agencies are going to be running out of money at midnight on Friday, and that could force federal agencies to shut down and could force the second federal shutdown we've had here in DC in 3 years. Two, the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen told Congress that they have until December 15th to increase the nation's borrowing limit, or they're going to risk defaulting. And that could potentially do things like raise interest rates, drop those stock prices that we saw on the rise today, and government programs like Social Security could be affected. They also need to approve the defense authorization bill. That sets the priorities and policies for the coming year, but if it doesn't pass, it could prevent some service members from receiving hazard pay, or it could delay military projects, things like that. And there's been talk of tying that to increasing the borrowing limit. And then, of course, there's the Build Back Better spending bill that President Biden has been encouraging folks on the Hill to pass. He talked about it today and the importance of passing it in terms of affecting prescription drug prices. And Senator Chuck Schumer sent a letter to senators, to his colleagues, saying that he hopes to get this passed before Christmas. But that seems like a pretty ambitious goal, especially because right now we still have a lot of questions about where Manchin and Sinema stand, which is hard to say. It's been so long. I feel like the questions about what Manchin and Sinema think of this bill, those have been questions we've been talking about for quite a long time here. And of course, Republicans do not plan to support this bill at all. So a very long list of things that they have to get done. And these are not exactly easy laws that they can just go in and vote and be certain that they're going to have all the votes there to get it all done in time.
Yeah, a long list indeed, and we're reminded of that deadline by that lovely Christmas tree behind you, Meridith, by the way, getting in the spirit. So, Major, let's talk about this phone call that President Biden is going to be having with the Russian President Putin tomorrow. So the White House says it's going to be a long one. What ground exactly do you expect that they'll cover?
First and foremost, it will all be about the Russian troops massing on the border of Ukraine. 90,000 so far. U.S. intelligence estimates put that projected troop deployment from Moscow along that shared border with Ukraine at 175,000. And the United States has made it abundantly clear through the president's rhetoric and that of Jen Psaki, the press secretary, that Russia ought not to invade or do anything similar to what it did in 2014 when it used an incursion to essentially occupy, against international law, the eastern section of Ukraine. And the Russian perspective on this looks to be to mass troops, to make things look very threatening, as a lever against the West generally, and the United States specifically, to deter for the time being any future consideration, meaning right now, of adding Ukraine to the NATO alliance. The Russians oppose that. They have always opposed that. And it has been the NATO countries that have looked at this, considered it, leaned in that direction, and certainly with the arrival in the last 2 or 3 years of more American military equipment and American military trainers, there has been a general philosophical move in Ukraine away from Russia and Moscow and more toward the West. It is certainly more hospitable to the idea of joining NATO than it has been previously. No commitments on either side. But the Russians are sending a signal: we don't want to lose Ukraine from what Russia considers its sphere of influence. And adding it to the NATO alliance would do that in a very real way. So it doesn't appear certain, and even the Ukrainians doubt whether or not Putin would invade and go to a formal and full-blown armed conflict over the future of Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have made it pretty clear, with the help of military training from the United States and other Western European allies, plus the arrival of much more lethal military equipment in the last 2 or 3 years, they're better prepared to repel a Russian invasion than they were back in 2014, and are willing and will fight if necessary. So does Putin really want a bloody conflict over the future of Ukraine, or does he want a lever against President Biden to deal with this NATO issue, which has been simmering for years?
We're going to dig into this issue a little bit later in the hour. Meridith, meantime, you have some new reporting out on a D.C. National Guard official accusing 2 senior Army leaders of lying to Congress and trying to rewrite the military response to the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Who is this, and what is he alleging?
Yeah, so my colleague and I obtained this 36-page memo from a former top National Guard official who was at the commanding general Walker's side. He was the commanding general of the DC National Guard on January 6th, on that day, as decisions were being made about where and when to deploy the National Guard. And in this memo, Colonel Earl Matthews, he's now in the Army Reserves, but he also held pretty high-ranking positions in the Trump administration and with the Defense Department. But in this memo, he claims that two top Army generals were lying when they testified in front of Congress about events and decisions that were made on January 6th. He also says that the Defense Department Inspector General's report is written with errors and is an attempt. And he also talks about, the Army having a secret unpublished report on that day that has been referenced in congressional testimony but hasn't been seen by the public. That is an attempt to whitewash how the Army and how Army officials responded to the events of that day. But one of the things in particular he takes issue with is a certain 2:30 p.m. call on January 2nd, where the National Guard, he said, was clean with officials to let them go to the Capitol as the Capitol was under siege. And he says that these two Army officials, they had concerns about the optics of deploying the National Guard or military up to the Hill, and did not allow for them to move forward with that at the time. And as you know, the National Guard did not go up to the Hill until much later in that day. But there has been months of back and forth among city officials, among the Pentagon and the DC National Guard about decision-making about when certain forces should have been brought up there that may have mitigated some of the really catastrophic damage that we saw happen on Capitol that day.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Meridith, so that 2:30 phone call, that critical phone call, that was made on the day of the insurrection itself, on January 6th, where we watched those pictures unfolding on real time. I remember that time frame quite well because we were just beginning to get a sense of the picture of what was happening on Capitol Hill. That phone call was on that day, correct?
Yes, it was on that day, and we published the memo in its entirety. There are a lot of really fascinating details in there. This is somebody that we haven't heard yet from on January 6th, but was in the room and worked closely with a lot of top decision makers. So I'm sure the January 6th committee is going to be interested in what he has to say. And we also published a timeline from the National Guard that was compiled the next day. So there's still many details emerging about what happened on January 6th that's helping us get a fuller picture. But again, as we get more information, more questions are arising about exactly what transpired.
All right, finally, Major, Senator Bob Dole passed away early Sunday morning at the age of 98. I know you spoke a bit earlier about him. What is his legacy in Washington?
I would say this, and it's hard to summarize someone's political career that was as long and deeply involved as Bob Dole's in a couple of sentences, but I would say, from my vantage point, covering him throughout the 1990s in Congress, Bob Dole was a fierce Republican. He was a partisan, for sure. He stood with his party and defended it against all sorts of attacks, but he was also far more interested in watching and learning how the wheels of Washington worked, meshed together, and produced results than he was watching them spin and just be part of the partisan rhetoric about the spinning of those Washington power wheels. And I would say where we are right now in Washington is the wheels spin a lot more than they mesh and produce results. And Bob Dole, like many of the lawmakers of his generation, World War II and early Vietnam generation, were deeply interested in making Congress work productively. Sometimes that meant winning on a partisan basis. Sometimes that meant losing on a partisan basis. Oftentimes it meant finding some kind of middle ground. And Bob Dole, over his career, learned more and more about how to accomplish those things in a bipartisan way and find the best out of a compromise, not the worst, and keep the process of Washington moving forward. But he was a party loyalist, to be sure. He was a defender almost to the end of Richard Nixon and the height of Watergate. He was the only living Republican presidential nominee to endorse Donald Trump because he'd won the Republican Party nomination and because, as a result, he should be supported by fellow Republicans. That was Bob Dole's approach. But in the main, he learned how to become a successful, accomplished bipartisan legislator and is, in that sense, a throwback. One other thing, Elaine, he also had a deeply self-deprecating sense of humor, something I have found in every single politician I've ever covered, who, unlike those who haven't been to war, who treat politics as if it were war, people who have actually been in war know it's not and have a kind of emotional and psychic separation from it and are much more prone to laugh at themselves and laugh at some of the absurdities of politics than those who treat it as war, who've actually never seen it.
And very quickly, Major, I know you tweeted about this. I know you talked to Anne Marie Green, our colleague, about this. But you have covered and met a lot of famous and powerful people in Washington, but you have very few pictures of those famous and powerful people. Bob Dole was one of those people whose pictures you actually kept. Tell us why, very quickly.
Because he sent it to me. I'm not one of the people in Washington who like to gather pictures of people I've stood next to who are famous. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with people who are or have the walls of the famous people. I just don't. But Bob Dole sent me a picture. I think it was 1992. And I learned this morning also that we wrote down my first child's first words in 1996. Her first two words were Bob Dole and President Clinton.
Gosh. That is very much
That's what happens when you're a child born in
story.
Washington, D.C. That's what happens, and your dad's in the media.
On that note, Major Garrett, Meridith McGraw. I feel like it's M³ today, by the way. Meridith, Major on a Monday. I love it. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.